have spent the last 5 years following, diving with, and telling stories about a group of Black scuba divers who dive for slave shipwrecks around the world. It's been an incredible journey, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today. I have to say first, though, that I didn't start out as a diver. Before I started to do this work, I wasn't a diver. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, which is a landlocked city in the US. I didn't know anything about the ocean. I also wasn't really that into the past, into history. I am a sci-fi fantasy girl. I like to think about the future, don't like to look in the past. But in 2016, someone offered me a ticket to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Has anybody been to that museum in D.C.? Yes, incredible place, right? Yeah, it's an incredible place. And when I got a ticket back in 2016, again, I wasn't really into history, but I felt like I needed to go because the museum had just opened and it was a big deal. This is a museum that cost over $270 million. It was on the National Mall, and it was the first museum to really tell the history of African Americans in the US. So I decided to go. And I ended up on the second floor of the museum, and I saw a picture there that changed my life. It was a picture of a group of primarily Black women in wetsuits on a boat. Now, I had never really seen a group of Black women in wetsuits on a boat before. And the women in that picture looked so joyous and beautiful to me. They looked so free. It was almost like they were superheroes to me. I tell you that the picture itself was a really ordinary picture. Like, I've looked at it since then, and I'm like, what? It's just a picture of people sitting on the boat. But for me in that moment, it was like the picture transformed, and it was like those women, they were all sitting on the boat, but it was like they had on capes, and the capes were billowing in the wind, and it was like they had their hands balled up into fists on their hips, and they were standing there like superheroes. And I wanted to know who they were and what they were doing. So I read on about them, and I discovered that they were a part of this group called Diving with a Purpose, and that their mission was to search for and to help document these slave shipwrecks around the world. So I immediately called them up to find out more, and they invited me to come and dive with them. And so I did. And that invitation brought adventure to my life, and it brought the ocean to my life. Again, I grew up in this landlocked place, so I didn't know anything about the ocean. I didn't know how magical and beautiful it was. And I didn't know that I needed it in my life. So I want to play an audio clip for you of me experiencing the ocean. And I'm going to play a couple of audio clips for you this morning. So I also invite you to close your eyes and just listen. Blue, as far as my eye can see. Salt spray tickling my face. The motion of the boat as it skims across the surface. It's beating us toward adventure. Next to me in the boat are women and men, all in wetsuits, all ages. Afros and braids are flying in the wind. They all look invincible. And they've got these big smiles on their faces. Out there, ahead of us, is a ship that's been buried under the waves for over 300 years. A ship like that once brought our ancestors to this side of the world.
Some incredible stories that these vessels have, but they're out of memory, out of mind. Why is that?
Mask on. I take one more look around, and then I tip over the side. I drop in. I love scuba diving. The way I feel like I'm in another universe, like I'm flying. I'm under the water, but here I can actually breathe. So not only did this work bring me to the ocean, as I trained with Diving with a Purpose, I also began to learn more of the history of these slave shipwrecks. And I learned more of the history of the transatlantic slave trade. And I learned things that I didn't know before. There's one statistic in particular that I didn't know that astounded me. Maybe this is something that you already know, but I didn't know this. I learned that historians estimate that approximately 1.8 million Africans lost their lives in the crossing from Africa to the Americas. I want you to be with that number for a second. 1.8 million Africans lost their lives. And we're not talking about the number of people who lost their lives on the march to the boats, or the number of people who lost their lives once they arrived and were enslaved. Just in the crossing of the Atlantic from one shore to the other, 1.8 million people were lost. They say that the Atlantic Ocean is one of the most turbulent oceans on the planet. And some say that that's because it's churning with the souls of these forgotten people. I didn't know this number. I don't know who's mourning that enormous amount of loss. So that made me feel like there's a chapter in history that's missing, and that maybe I could help bring some of that history back into memory. And so I applied for a grant from National Geographic, and I got it. And that grant allowed me to travel around the world with these divers on all the missions that they were doing. So we traveled to Mozambique, to South Africa, to Senegal, Benin, Togo, to Costa Rica, to St. Croix, and around the US. And I want to share a picture of some of the divers that I dove with. These are people from all over the world. They are students, they're professors, they're yoga teachers, they're dancers, they're policemen, they're archaeologists. They come from all walks of life, and it was incredible to dive with them. So I started writing blog entries about my travels. But soon I realized that trying to write 200-word entries about this history was impossible. So I went back to National Geographic and I asked them for more funding to produce a podcast, and they gave it to me. So that's what you just heard a clip from. It's called Into the Depths, And I will take a little commercial break to say that Into the Depths is streaming on all audio platforms. So if you'd like to listen, you can listen to it. The podcast tells the story of 6 of the ships that have been found. It also tells the stories of some of the divers, and it tells my story. The story of how this work has transformed my relationship with the past, and it's transformed my relationship with myself. So this work brought me to the ocean, it brought me adventure, but I think that I was also called to this work for a bigger reason. And I think many of you might relate to that, because I think you've also been called to your work for a bigger reason. I've been reading about your work, I've been listening to some of the talks, and it is impressive, and it is beautiful work that you are doing. You are changing your communities, and I applaud you for that. I applaud you for answering the call, because I think that we are at an inflection point in the world right now. I think we're at a moment in time when we can either choose to spiral deeper into fear of each other, or we can choose to say that we see each other in the dark, and we can reach out our hands to each other, and we can walk together toward the light. So I'm not particularly religious, but I happened to be visiting my mom's house a few years ago. This is right when this work was getting ready to start. And my mother's pastor was at her house. And my mom asked her pastor to bless my work. And when my mother asks people to do stuff, they do it. And so I allowed him to bless the work. And I want to play this clip for you of what he said to me.
If you can get in tune with the essence, the spirit of those of our ancestors who were lost during that middle passage, invite their blessing on the work. You can do so by your prayer meditation. You come across names, speak their names, speak the names, and then ask them to bless you. Ask them for permission to tell the story. Ask them to go before you to make the way straight, smooth, and harmonious.
Listen. I hold their stories in my arms. Stories from the depths of my ocean. I've memorized every inch of their heartbeats. There is a song growing in my waves we have not heard before. Listen. It speaks their names.
So the picture on the left is the picture of the cover of the podcast that I did with Nat Geo. And the picture on the right, this is my right, is the cover story that Nat Geo invited me to write for them. They leaned into the telling of this story, and I'm really grateful to them for doing that. And they invited me to be on the cover of the magazine, and I became the first Black female explorer to be featured on the cover of National Geographic magazine. And I think that's extraordinary because, again, of this moment that we're in, where I think we're all being called. It's not only people who are being called, but I think it's institutions that are being called. So I played that clip for you because when, and the pastor's name is Bishop Jack. When Bishop Jack told me to speak their names, it opened up a whole vista for me. I realized that by speaking these names, I could help bring their stories up from the depths, and I could tell them in their fullness, in their wonder, with love and with respect. I could tell stories that have been lost to time. When I think about social cohesion, when I think about where we are in this moment in time, it feels like there is a need for some very mighty truth-telling. In this time of deep fear of the other, we must realize that our fates are tied to each other as well as to the planet. Centuries of colonialism, of systemic racism, of greed, I think they've distorted the way that we see each other. But for us to have a planet that survives, it's urgent that we acknowledge the messy and the complicated truths upon which our society has been built and that still keep the majority of its people in the margins. So to dismantle the power structures that keep us separated, we have to tell truths. And these are truths that embrace both the pain and the joy, defeat and victory, suffering and resilience, commonalities and diversities. And maybe that seems like a lot. Maybe it seems like it's hard and traumatic work, but to me it isn't. To me, this isn't only about pain and shame and the heaviness of the past, although it is about some of that. But to me, this is about moving through the pain in order to get to a new place. I know that when I am under the water, when I am diving these sites, I feel such power and agency. And I feel that because I realize that I have, that these divers have, that these historians, these archaeologists, all these people who are involved in this work have raised our hands and we've said, we're not going to wait on other people to prioritize this history. No, we are going to find this history and we're going to bring it up from the depths and we're going to share it with the world. So we're saying that this history matters and we're volunteering to put it out there. So that feels important to me. And I also think that there's a way in which the transatlantic slave trade is not thought about in its broadest possibilities. But there's a way that the transatlantic slave trade changed everything. This isn't just about Black history or American history. The transatlantic slave trade was 400 years of transporting 12.5 million people across the waters. It created wealth, it destroyed wealth, it changed coastlines and landscapes, it created trade routes that are still in existence today. It ushered in a new age of political, economic, and social dominance that's still in existence today. So it did all of those things, but it also connected us as a world. When you think about the transfer of beliefs, of cultures, of religions, of philosophies, of people, of music, of style, of all of those things that happened because of the transatlantic slave trade. Europe, Africa, South America, North America, and the Caribbean are forever intertwined because of those voyages across the Atlantic. So I wonder, what if we lean into that? What if by thinking about it from that angle, we begin to change how we see each other? And if we begin to change how we see each other, does that begin to change how we think we're responsible for each other? So I think that we can hack social cohesion by doing some mighty truth-telling, but I also think that we can do some mighty truth-telling about the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and that could change things. I want to tell you one small story about one of the ships so that you can see a concrete example of how this work is happening. This is a story of the São José Paquete de Africa. It was a ship that was found in, or announced in 2015 in Cape Town, South Africa. So that ship was found to be a ship that left from Mozambique. It was a Portuguese ship, and it was headed to Brazil. And it wrecked in Cape Town in South Africa. And when it wrecked, the team that found it discovered that the people who were in the cargo hold were a people called the Makua. And the Makua are a people, a lot of them, or they still have descendants that are from Mozambique Island, which is a small island in the north of Mozambique. So when the team found out that this ship was connected to that place, they decided to take word of what happened to the ship back to the Makua descendants. And when they did that, the Makua descendants decided to have a celebration. And they had a day of dances, of speeches, of music. And the Makua chief that day gave a gift to the divers. It was a gift it was a cowrie shell encrusted vessel. And he put into that vessel soil from Mozambique Island. And he charged the team with going back to South Africa and sprinkling the soil over the wreck site so that for the first time in over 200 years, their ancestors could touch home. So the dive team did that. They went back to South Africa and they poured the soil over the site. And they asked an African American, a Mozambican, and a South African to perform the ceremony. And they say that when they did that ceremony that day, those seas were really stormy, and it was raining that day, and it was very windy, and it was hard for the divers to get out to the site. They had to hold on to each other to get out to the site. And so they performed the ceremony and they came out. And everyone says that when they came out, the seas calmed down and the sun came out. I wasn't there, so I can't confirm that, but that's what everybody says. I was able to visit the site 3 years later, and I want to play this last clip for you of what that experience was like. I met with a man named Albie Sachs, who is a South African luminary. He was appointed to the High Court in South Africa by Nelson Mandela. He was a well-known apartheid fighter, and he was the patron of the ceremony that day because it was such a rainy day. He, people came to his house to get out of the weather. So I was able to hang out with Albie that day, and I just want to play you this last clip of what our encounter was. I went to Albie's house for an impromptu holiday party. He and his wife, Vanessa, were celebrating the eclectic group of family and friends who just happened to be in town. I could smell the sea from his balcony. I could hear the buzz of conversations of neighbors across other bungalows nearby and the laughter of children as they played below in the cold waters. I waded in and out of conversation with activists, reporters, social innovators. I noshed on freshly made pumpkin cakes and drank tonic water. And I sat with Albie for a bit and talked about Clifton Beach and how most of its residents had no clue that only 50 or so meters away from the sand laid this shipwreck.
It happened in our paradise. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the world. He stopped at Cape Town and described it as the fairest cape he'd ever seen. So we are the fairest cape, and I feel the irony of that. The fairest cape was the unfairest cape. I'm looking out there, and it's just so beautiful here, and you see the waves coming in and the beaches nearby. Everything is so tranquil, and we're so safe in our homes looking out. And I think of the fun that I had growing up on the beach, and everything is just so lovely and so beautiful. It's a kind of a paradise where I am, and in that paradise there was hell. And then I don't visually imagine the people. It's almost too much for me to imagine the people drowning. I visualize and imagine the timbers and the bits of metal lying down in the ocean bed.
We watched the sun as it began its slow trajectory home after a bright day's work. And I took out my camera to snap a picture of Albie on the balcony in front of the São José wreck site. Framed behind him, I could see a palm tree on the shore and two boulders jutting out of the water, the visible markers of what lay below. But Albie leaned over as my finger hovered over the button and said quietly in my ear, "I can't smile in front of this." It was like the rest of the house went stage dark, and only Albie and I and the wreck site stood in the spotlight. And here's the thing. Turns out this holiday party at Albie's house, this conversation happened around the 27th of December, 224th anniversary of the wrecking of the São José. I didn't realize it until I'd returned home. Jaloki said the ancestors were guiding me. Albie, an 87-year young, white, Jewish, South African luminary, and I, an astrology-loving black girl writer from the dirty South, standing in silence, amid the noise of the party, enacting our own private ritual, our own ceremony, paying homage to the Makua ancestors together, united in our commitment to see the humanity of a group of people we had wordlessly agreed would be remembered on this day. I felt complete. So I think that there is a lot of healing work that can happen through this look at the slave trade and slave shipwrecks. And right now, National Geographic and I are, it's why I became an explorer in residence, because we are embarking on a pretty ambitious project next. We're going to be doing a reverse boat journey of the transatlantic slave trade. We'll be traveling to approximately 30 countries in Europe, North America, South America, and Africa. And we will be visiting sites of significance. We will be gathering stories from marginalized communities whose voices aren't often included in the understanding of the legacy of the trade. And we will finally acknowledge and honor that loss of life. Our plan is to put 4 memorials down in the waters of each continent that participated in the trade. If you are interested in more about this journey, feel free to sign up at National Geographic. We'll be putting more and more notes about what we're doing. You can listen to the podcast. You can follow me on Instagram if you're interested. But ultimately, I think we're all in this together, and I am just excited about this work to tell truth, to tell the truth of the past. I think things are changing, and I'm excited about it. So thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to this story.